Hey everyone, Karen the Warped Spinster here. Back with my UFO accountability project, which has morphed quite a bit this week. As you can see, I did in fact keep track of what I worked on during the week, specifically related to my UFOs, and I had 2 quilts to focus on. One was to quilt the apparently Christmas Bargello quilt instead of Christmas, and then do the applique on Rocky Mountain Meadow. And I did, in fact, finish both of those things and ended up doing some other things as well. As a result of what I learned this week, I've made a couple of decisions. One is that I want this to be a notebook that records all of the quilting projects that I work on during the week, not just the UFO. I still want to focus on the UFO, 1 or 2 quilts per week that I want to work on, but I also want to leave room to note when I work on other quilts as well. And I have done that here. And I just put stars then by the things that related to the UFOs that I was working on. This will probably change quite a bit. Most of the things here are starred because I'm trying to get some things finished before a guild meeting in a couple of weeks. But that will likely change, and I will be working on, well, I guess technically everything I'm working on is UFO, if you want to look at it that way. But I have both personal projects and projects for the Warped Spinster business, and those are going to be mixed together. Sometimes they're sort of inextricably linked and sometimes not. So I'm going to keep the same format, I think, but it may look a little bit different. And one of the things that I learned is that I wanted to make some notes about things or particular quilts or processes, and that's going to take up too much room to make those kinds of notes. So I'm going to transfer those somewhere else. All of this wanting to organize and get things in lists, I think, is in the librarian in me, but I just like to have things laid out so I can see what I have ahead of me and then happily check things off when I actually get them finished. So this is going to be sort of the same. I'll use the same layout, and I won't go through creating that for you because that would bore you. You have your own UFO projects. Why watch me talk about mine? So I do have my list still that I will choose from. Yikes, lots of things to do. And many of these are related to the business, so I will probably be doing those first. But the Christmas Orphan particularly, I really need to be doing that. I have all of the blocks that I need pretty much, and it just needs to get done. I keep putting it up on the design wall, and it keeps coming down again. I keep taking photos of this is how I've arranged all these blocks, and then I take it down because I have to put something else up. I just have to do that. Now, in terms of what happened as a result of trying this out, auditioning this, I decided the first thing that I wanted to do was to create a long arm pattern notes. I discovered as I was doing one of the patterns, and I've known this before, but it really came home while I was quilting the Bargello quilt. I used a pattern that I like very much. It's well done, it stitches out well, but it's more intricate than it looks because it's curlicues, and if you have a curlicue, when you go into the center, then you have to come back out again and you retrace. And there are lots of curlicues in it, which makes it a lovely pattern, but it also means there's a lot of retracing, which takes a lot of time and a lot of thread. And I want to make note of that somewhere so that when I go to use that pattern again, if I'm considering that as one of my patterns, then I want to know that I have to have plenty of thread for it and plenty of time for it to stitch out. And there are other things. I'm working on quilting my Rocky Mountain Meadow quilt, I did finish the applique. That was on my UFO list. So I actually have it loaded up and I'm working on it. I have to check something out, but it seems to allow me to only do pretty big stitches. Excuse me, like maybe even larger than 9 per inch. It certainly is 10 per inch, and I aim a little more toward 11 to 12 per inch when I'm quilting. So I don't know if that's a function of how I set it up. When I first set it up, I had the machine set up at a larger stitch. I switched it, but that didn't change the stitching length. So I'm not sure if that's a function of how I set it up and the machine just didn't register that change, or because I really increased the size of the pattern, that the design on the quilt did not compensate for that, so it didn't change the stitch count as it got larger. I'm not sure about that, so I will have to look into that. But that's the kind of notes that I want to make here. So I thought about doing this, just taking notes in a notebook such as this as I was doing it, but then it's harder to go back and reference it. So unless I create an index, which is just extra work. So I've decided that I will probably put this into a spreadsheet on my iPad or the computer, and it doesn't matter which spreadsheet. I'll use numbers probably, or even Airtable, which is kind of a combination of database and spreadsheet, which is an online resource that I use for other things. Anyway, that will allow me to search through each. I can alphabetize the pattern names if I want, or the quilt that I put it on, whatever. I can just sort it however I want, so I can easily find what I'm looking for. So I will probably have cells for or columns for rows for whichever, however I set it up, that will have the name of the pattern, who the designer was, the source of the pattern, where I bought it, and the quilt or quilts on which it's used, and then notes. So things like takes a long time to stitch and a lot of thread, that sort of thing. And the reason I've chosen the pattern, for an obvious reason, if I'm thinking I might want to use it again, then I can go back and look and see what notes I have about it. The designer, because if it's a pattern that I really like and stitches out really well, then I may want to take a look specifically at other patterns that designer has created. The source, so I can go back and find the designer on that same site, the source. And then the quilts on which it's used. If I have a quilt and I'm looking through them and I say, oh, I really like this design, but I don't remember the name of it, then I can just go back and sort it by the quilt, find the quilt, and find out which pattern I used on it. So that one is going to be imminent, I think, because I want to create that and take notes on the patterns that I'm using right now, and then I'll continue to use that in the future. One of the other things I want to do is a UFO inventory, and this is a little scary to me because I have so many UFOs, but that's kind of the point. I need to know what I have, maybe even where they are, and so I can sort of plan the UFOs and the time for it. I'm a librarian. I have to organize things. So we'll have the quilt pattern name. The date started, I don't know. Most of them I probably don't know, and it would be kind of a shaming tool, I think. So I'm not sure I want to do that, or even can do it. And then the status of it. And I'm not sure about the status in relation to left to do, because I want to have notes about, okay, I'm only at piecing. I've got a long way to go on this one. Or all I have to do is put on the borders in order to finish the top, at least. There are probably a lot of those because I don't like to sew borders on. Or does it just need quilting or binding or whatever? So it would be less time than if I'm at like the cutting stage and I still have to do all of this stuff. It just helps me to give a rough estimate of time. I wonder if I should do something like size. I could take considerable notes about I've just started piecing. I mean, that's what the left to do is. Maybe all of this, just the sort of summary, would go up to status so I can sort it. But then left to do can have more detail, like I've only pieced one block. I've got 154 to go or something. I can go into more detail. And then the date finished because, I like to check things off. And all of this will help me then when I'm planning my UFO list for the accountability project. And then the last thing that's coming out of it is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and that's a quilt documentation for quilts that I make. I'm really bad about this. If it's a quilt for the business, if I'm doing a pattern, then I'm more likely to have at least photos because I post them on Facebook or Instagram. But I really would like to start doing a little better documentation. I don't even put labels on my quilts, which is horrible. Put labels on your quilts. Do as I say and not as I don't do. So the quilt documentation will have things like the name of the quilt and the fabric that I used, if I know what that is at this point, the pattern or book that I used, size, maybe some fabric samples, notes on it, really fun to do, didn't take long, whatever. And then also what I used for the backing. If I know that part of the problem is going to be that some of these are so old, I have no idea who the pattern was from or any of the information about the fabric for that matter. So I want to start keeping track of that from the beginning, and then the quilting pattern and anything else that might be of interest, date finished, etc., etc. If it's in someone else's collection, if I've given it away or sold it, that will all be in the documentation. So that will be in a perhaps an upcoming weekly thing. Instead of a weekly UFO accountability project, as I say, you don't care about seeing all of this stuff because you have your own UFO things to do. I think I'll start working on some of these things and sharing these in case they're useful to any of you if you want to do something similar. If, say, long arm pattern notes, if it would be useful to you, I can send you the template for the spreadsheet or whatever, or post that if that would be useful to you. So that's what I have planned for weeks coming up for the UFO accountability project. These are all sort of related to that, kind of like, right? These are going to be weekly chats, I guess, instead of UFO. And in the process of looking through this, I, once again, being a librarian, have things planned out here. And this is my annual plan for what I want for each quarter. My basic goals are to do 4 patterns in 4 classes each year, at least. And so this is my mapping out what I've done and what I will do. And I did pretty well in the second quarter. And however, I can see things that I was supposed to do and I haven't done yet. And then in the current quarter, the third quarter, I see pointless and shuffleboard. I know what I think pointless is. It's what have been calling soup to nuts, but I think soup to nuts is the process that I use to design it, and pointless is the quilt. So I do have obviously work to do on that. I'm currently piecing that. My block riffs class, I adapted and put up on my Thinkific classroom, so that's available for anyone, even if you aren't on Skillshare. Mid-century signs, I still want to do that one, and I need, that should be one of my UFO projects. It's a class rather than a quilt, but all of these are UFO projects. Honestly, I don't know which quilt design I called shuffleboard at this point. That's the problem with creative names. I don't remember what it is. So I will have to go back and look at shuffleboard because I do not have it designed. So it must have been a process. This is horrible. I need to check in more often. you're seeing all of my quirks related to quilting. Part of the problem is that, of course, I have the business things that I want to do, and then I also have personal things, quilting things that I want to do, and those get all mashed together, of course. That's where I'm at. I did do this as promised. I can check that one off, and I will do my next week so I can get started on that. I think I know what my 2 focus quilts are going to be, I think. And then I have all these other things to work on this week too. I was fortunate, I spent a couple of mornings at the car shop, fix-it shop, which was lovely. They have a lovely space. It's a new building, and it's bright and cheerful and large enough to have people sitting at least 6 feet apart if they're waiting, because we're in the midst of resurge of COVID. And they had tables with outlets so I could sit and work on things. And one of the things I started was the pattern for high rise, which I hadn't really planned on doing a pattern, but I posted it on a modern quilt Facebook group that I belong to. And I had several people ask me what the pattern was, when is it going to be ready. So I'm going to be working on that. Made good progress on that. So having that time set aside when I didn't have quilting and sitting at the sewing machine as an option, then I could spend some time working on that. I do need to do some work on quilt fabric design to do too. So I will be keeping plenty busy this week. I hope you will be busy with fun things, that you're all happy and healthy. Be well, be happy, be quilting. Peace out.